Finally, I'd like to ask my friend and colleague from my DHB, Sarah Imray, who's the clinical nurse specialist for the patient at risk service, to come and talk about what we've been doing in Wellington for the last, she'll tell you how many years. Sarah, thanks.
Oh, there's a lot of you here. Thank you, Alex, and thank you for inviting me or volunteering me, Anne. I appreciate it. I'm going to share with you the journey of the PAR service at CCDHB, from its humble beginnings to a service that is now well respected throughout the DHB. In order to share this journey with you, I've done a fair bit of research, talking to past original members of the team over many cups of coffee and glasses of wine, the things we do for research. But it's their stories and experiences that I'm going to share with you today. I have removed some of the colourful language. I don't want to offend anybody. So although the service started in 2008, it was the events 4 years prior to this that started the ball rolling. I'd like to introduce you to a 50-year-old gentleman who in 2004 was admitted with acute breathlessness, cough and fever. 2 days later, this man was pronounced dead at 6:16 a.m. after a failed resuscitation attempt. This man should never have died. The untimely death of this gentleman, now known as Patient A, was the catalyst for the CCDHB to develop an outreach service and an early warning school. Recommendations from the HDC was that Wellington Hospital had to implement this, and this should be looked to be taken across New Zealand. 4 years later, because we worked really quickly, and not 4 years of just sitting there talking to people, it was 4 years of kind of people banging their heads against a brick wall. I recently spoke with Steve James, who's the current charge nurse manager at Wellington ICU, and he describes how he had meetings with senior medical and nursing management about this service, and they were adamant that this service was not needed and that it would possibly take another Patient A for it to become effective. But in 2008, we saw a naive nurse come home to New Zealand and begin the process of establishing the PAR service. And I'm sure you'll all recognise Jenny up there. I recently had a coffee with Jenny, and she shared with me a video recording of her first conference presentation, and it was titled "The Reluctant Hospital: How Not to Implement a System for Recognising and Responding Clinical Deterioration." During our talk, Jenny admits that she looks back on this and sees how negative it came across and how burnt out she felt 2 years after the implementation of PAR. And after listening to her story and listening and talking to original PAR members, I can fully understand why. She openly admits that she came into the role very naive. She talks about her first meeting with general medical consultants. She describes how she was completely unprepared for their response and unprofessionalism to what she thought would be a nice thing to do. Some of these consultants even requested that their patients be excluded from any form of early warning school. Jenny was the first PAR nurse at CCDHB. She worked Monday to Friday, 10 to 6, and this was in April in 2008. It was only on the 2 general medical wards. 2 months later, 4 other nurses joined the team: Greg, Donna, Anne, and Mary. And a few months later, saw some more nurses join. They all come from a critical care background predominantly ICU, but they had no training in outreach. They had no idea what they were doing. They would go out onto the ward under the premise of reviewing the ICU discharges. That was how they got onto the ward. And then they would very gently and very nicely ask if there was any patients the nurses were concerned about. This service was one of the first of its kind. It was nurse-led, it was part-time, and it was not well received. No one likes to be told that they don't know how to look after their sick patients. The first early warning score at Wellington Hospital was the PAR score, and it had its very own escalation pathway there. And this was replaced by the early warning score, vital sign chart, the first one. And I asked Alex if he could send me a copy because I didn't have a copy, and he did. And in the subject heading, he put, "Ugh, this is ugly." He was right, of course. The PAR team kept communication books, and these books kept a record of experiences, good and bad. And I've had permission to share some of them with you. And as I say, I hope I don't offend, and I've took out some words. Found a couple of patients on a medical ward that had low SATs of 70s. I sat them up and I increased their oxygen, and bugger me, I fixed them. I had a satisfying night. I saved a narked lady, but I didn't save a 92-year-old. But I did stop the doc from overloading her with palliative IV fluids. Yikes. Scared to leave the office. Right, must see patients, not kill anyone, and spread the PAR love. Phew, survived another day. I have reviewed the 12 hours leading up to a cardiac arrest. No obs taken since the night before and no respiratory rate recorded. Dr. A smiled at me today. Miracles happen. I think we're winning. I got a cardiology referral. And this has to be my favourite one, I think, and I know a lot of nurses will know the punchline before it comes. I went to review a patient and I asked a new graduate to do a set of vital signs for me. She came back looking a little bit confused and said, "They're very different from the previous set. And the patient doesn't look quite right." I went in to look, and you nurses all know this, and the patient was dead. Thankfully, they were NFR. Although we can smile and look back at these stories and have a giggle, and believe you me, I've read those books and I have laughed. Jenny says there was a lot of times there would be a PAR nurse in her office crying, purely because of the unprofessionalism of their peers. Donna, who I mentioned earlier, she still works for me. She's still a PAR nurse, and I think that is amazing. She tells me often that she would go for counselling, and that counselling was offered to all of them to help them get through this. Jenny recognised pretty early on that data was her friend. She didn't quite know what to collect, so she collected everything. And if you could see all the paperwork that I inherited, you can see she certainly did. But it was this data that saved the PAR team. The hospital decided they were going to go 24/7, which looked at the operational management over the 24-hour period, basically. And it was suggested that the PAR service become incorporated with duty nurse managers and resource nurses. Jenny and Anne put arguments and presented data, and they kindly saw that this would not be a viable option. This is data from the first 2008-2009 service report that Jenny and Anne wrote. And you can see that the predominant referral mechanism is through ICU follow-ups. But that's a very thin slither there was 777 calls. PAR was not part of the rapid response team at this stage. In fact, when they turned up to assist in any cardiac arrest, they were politely, if that's a word I could use, asked to leave and were not involved. The predominant 777 calls were cardiac arrest. MET was available, but nobody truly understood what MET was. It was this data and the perseverance of the PAR team that laid the roots for the development of rapid response, not only at Wellington Hospital, but across New Zealand. In 2010, Jenny moved to Australia and continued her work in early recognition and response, and Anne took over at the helm. Anne continued to raise the profile of PAR, not only within the DHB, but also nationally. Within the DHB, we sat together and we wrote our mission statement, which we were very proud of, and we still have up in our office. The service went 24 hours. We became members of the rapid response team, and MET became mandatory at CCDHB. As Alex spoke in the beginning, between 2012 and 2014, Anne and Alex preached, educated and begged for the development of a national early warning school. They travelled across New Zealand and talked to anyone who would listen. Anne describes how they were in a taxi to do their last talk, and they both said, if this doesn't work, we're giving up. Thankfully, they didn't. We now have the National Early Warning Score across the DHBs, and we have the development of outreach team. We have the HQSC deteriorating patient programme, and just look around us all here today. Since 2015, I'm now in the hot seat, and it is my responsibility that the work of Jenny and Anne continues. I'm in the process of working with the co-design team on the Career of My project, and the medical team at CCDHB have a working goals of care document in place. And I want to share a story with you that happened just last week, and I think it's quite a good thing to mention here. I was reviewing a patient on an orthopaedic ward, and there was a young nurse sitting behind a desk, and she saw me and she had this great big smile on her face, and she was extremely chatty and happy. And I was talking to her, and she said she remembers her very first Met call and how she felt completely out of her depth looking after this patient that was deteriorating. And then she felt very intimidated by the Met team as we all rocked up. But she said she felt empowered because the PAR nurse stood by her side. She felt supported, that she could voice her concerns and not be ridiculed. She said she could not imagine ever working without a PAR service. And I did think, wow, we've come a long way. I mentioned at the beginning patient A, and I think it's only fitting that I end my talk with patient A. So this was his trajectory, unfortunately, in 2004. On the first night, if he was alive today, he would have had an early warning score of 8. So we would have got a reg and a PAR review. On his second day, during the second day, he had an early warning score of 9. Again, a PAR and a reg review. And we would have been pushing at this point because we would have seen the trend for an ICU opinion and referral. Overnight, the ward nurse, was concerned. So she could have made a 777 call. And he would have definitely been seen by an ICU reg at this point. Prior to his demise, his respiratory rate elevated to a point where a mandatory Met call would have been made. He would have certainly been admitted into ICU at this point. I think patient A's family can feel assured that his death was not in vain. Thank you.